Winter in the Uintah Basin is not merely a season, it is a siege. In January of 1994, the mercury sat stubbornly at 20 degrees below zero, a temperature that turns the sagebrush into glass and makes the very act of breathing feel like an imposition on the lungs. The silence out here is heavy. It presses against the eardrums, vast and indifferent. It is a landscape of red rock and high desert scrub, carved by wind and time, indifferent to the small, warm things that try to live upon it. Terry Sherman was one of those small, warm things. A cattleman, a man who understood the brutal arithmetic of the West. You feed the land, you water the herd, and if God and the market are kind, you survive another year. He had bought these 512 acres to build a legacy. He brought his wife, his children, and his prize herd of Simmental cattle. These were not generic livestock. They were investments, walking bank accounts wrapped in hide and muscle. On this particular morning, Sherman walked out into a field covered in 18 inches of fresh, undisturbed powder. The sun was just cresting the ridge, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. He was looking for a cow that had separated from the group. He found her. She was a commercial cow, solid, healthy, weighing in at 1,200 pounds. She lay on her side in the snow, dead. But death on a ranch is common. It is the nature of the death that stops a man's heart. There was no blood. Let that sink in. A mammal of that size contains roughly 10 gallons of blood. When a coyote takes a calf, it is a mess. It is a ragged, tearing, bloody affair. This was clean. This was sterile. Sherman approached the carcass, his boots crunching in the snow, the only sound in the entire basin. He looked for tracks. A mountain lion, a wolf, a pack of wild dogs. Anything to explain the kill. There were no tracks. The snow around the cow was pristine, an unbroken sheet of white extending for hundreds of yards in every direction. It was as if the animal had been dropped from the sky, placed gently by a giant, invisible hand. He knelt down. The horror was in the details. The animal's left eye was gone, removed with a circular incision so precise it looked like it had been done with a laser. The udder had been cored out. The rectum excised. No jagged edges, no tearing of the tissue, and not a single drop of red on the white snow. It was a surgical procedure conducted in an open field in the freezing dark, without leaving a footprint. Sherman stood up. He looked at the ridge line. He looked at the sky. He was a man of practical skills, a man who fixed fences and birthed calves. He knew how the world worked, gravity, friction, biology, but standing there, with the steam of his breath freezing in the air, he realized that on this specific patch of earth, the rules he had lived by did not apply. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a primal reaction to being watched. This was not a crime scene. It was a message, and the message was simple. You do not own this place. You are not the predator here. You are the livestock. We like to think of the map as a settled thing. We draw lines, state lines, property lines, fence lines, and we convince ourselves that the laws of man and the laws of physics are uniform within them. We believe that an acre in Nebraska follows the same rules as an acre in New York. Gravity pulls down. Time moves forward. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. But what if the map has holes? What if there are places where the geometry of our reality is thin? Places where the membrane between here and somewhere else has worn through, like the elbows of an old coat. For centuries, The Ute tribe has warned of a path through the Uintah Basin they will not travel. They speak of the Skinwalker, a shape-shifting witch, a malevolent force that inhabits the land. But we are modern people. We dismiss folklore as the primitive attempt to explain the weather. We demand data. So, let us look at the data. Since the 1950s, this single plot of land, 512 acres of scrubland in northeastern Utah, has been the epicenter of more documented anomalies than any other location in North America. We are not talking about campfire stories. We are talking about readings on spectrum analyzers. We are talking about transient radiation spikes that cook human skin. We are talking about unidentified aerial phenomena tracked by military-grade radar. Billionaires have poured fortunes into this dirt. Robert Bigelow, a budget hotel magnate with a defense contract, bought it to turn it into a living laboratory. He spent millions building a cage to catch a ghost. He hired physicists, biochemists, and former intelligence officers. They surrounded the property with cameras. They locked it down. And the phenomenon looked right back at them, mocked them, and then followed them home. This is not a story about ghosts. It is not a story about little green men. It is a story about the arrogance of ownership. It is about the terrifying possibility that we are sharing this planet with an intelligence that views us with the same indifferent curiosity that we view a bacteria culture in a petri dish. The question is not whether something is happening at Skinwalker Ranch. The question is whether the human mind is capable of understanding it. Is this land haunted? Or is it simply a piece of technology we are too primitive to operate? The algorithms that govern this platform favor the short, the loud, and the shallow. They are designed to starve stories like this one. If you believe, as I do, that the truth requires patience and a pact of attention, signal your defiance by subscribing now. Chapter 1. The Path of the Skinwalker. They say the curse is ancient, something born from the earth itself, a black rot that was waiting in the soil long before a boot ever touched the dust. It makes for a convenient story. It suggests that the evil here is natural, inevitable, like a thunderstorm or a drought. But that is a lie we tell ourselves to absolve the guilty. The truth is not geological. It is political. And it is much, much younger than the rocks. The evil that festers on these 512 acres was not found here. It was placed here. It was a weapon of war, deployed with the specific strategic intent of psychological terror. It was an act of spiritual scorched earth. To understand the ranch, you have to understand the bowl of rock it sits in. The Uintah Basin. It is a geological cup, rimmed by mountains that act as a natural prison. To the north, the Uintah Mountains rise up like a wall of gray iron. To the south, the Tavaputs Plateau. In the middle lies a basin of high desert steppe, sagebrush, and pinyon pine. It is isolated. In 1861, when President Lincoln established the Uintah Valley Reservation, he wasn't giving the Ute people a home. He was giving them a cage. Brigham Young, the prophet of the Mormons, looked at this land and declared it one vast contiguity of waste. He wanted the fertile valleys for his saints. He left the rocks for the Utes. But the Utes were not alone in this landscape, and they were not innocent victims of circumstance. They were warriors, horse lords, and they had enemies. We tend to romanticize the indigenous history of the West as a monolith of harmony, broken only by the arrival of the white man. But the history of the high desert is a history of friction. Blood feuds ran deep, and the feud between the Ute and the Navajo was particularly bitter. In the mid-19th century, the dynamic wasn't just skirmishes over hunting grounds. It was commerce. It was slavery. Ute bands, occasionally allied with Kit Carson and the American Army, participated in campaigns against the Navajo. They raided settlements. They took captives. They sold Navajo children into slavery to Mexican households in Santa Fe and to the new Mormon settlers. The resentment this bred was not the kind that fades with a treaty signing. It was a cold, hard hatred that calcified in the bone. When the Navajo were finally broken, driven on the long walk to Bosque Redondo in 1864, they left something behind. A parting gift for their oppressors. The oral histories are guarded. You will not find them written in the ledgers of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But if you sit with the elders in Fort Duchesne, if you wait until the fire burns low and the trust is earned, they will tell you about the path of the Skinwalker. The Navajo curse was specific. They did not just curse the Ute people generally. They cursed the land they stood upon. They invoked the Yi-Naldlushi. In the English tongue, we translate this as skinwalker. It is a clumsy word. It brings to mind Hollywood monsters, werewolves, things that go bump in the night. It fails to capture the absolute moral transgression involved. To become a skinwalker is not a biological accident. It is a choice. It is the ultimate heresy against the Navajo way of life. Hojo, the concept of balance and beauty. To gain the power to shift one's form, to wear the skin of a coyote, a wolf, or a bear, a medicine man must commit an act of unspeakable depravity. Usually, the murder of a close family member, a sibling, a child. They shatter their own humanity to gain the speed of the wolf and the sight of the hawk. They become distinct from the human race. They are witches in the truest, darkest sense of the word. The legend says that the Navajo shamans sent these entities northward up into the Basin to plague the Utes, to hunt them, to watch them from the ridge lines, to ensure that they would never know peace in their vast contiguity of waste. And here is where the geography becomes critical. The Utes believed that this specific property, the land that would one day be fenced, deeded, and sold to Terry Sherman, lies directly in the corridor of this curse. It is a highway for the Yi-Naldlushi. For generations, the Ute people have given this land a wide berth. They do not hunt on it. They do not graze their horses on it. They refer to it as cursed ground. When the white settlers arrived in the early 20th century, flush with the Homestead Act and the arrogance of manifest destiny, they saw only free grass and water rights. They saw Bottle Hollow in the creek. They saw a place to winter cattle. They did not see the invisible fences that the locals respected. They didn't ask why the Utes would ride miles out of their way to avoid crossing that specific creek bed. They didn't ask why the birds seemed to go quiet in certain groves of cottonwood. The first white families who staked their claims here were walking into a crossfire they couldn't see. They were setting up their homesteads in the middle of a spiritual minefield that had been active for 50 years. They brought their plows and their Bibles, thinking they were taming a wilderness. They didn't realize they were squatting in a haunted house where the ghosts weren't dead people. They were living, breathing sorcerers with a vendetta that predated the concept of the state of Utah. The Myers family, Kenneth and Edith, would eventually buy the land. They were the bridge between the Old West and the modern era of the ranch, and they learned the lesson the hard way. They learned that you could hold the deed, you could pay the taxes, and you could string the barbed wire, but you couldn't lock the doors tight enough. By the time the Myers era ended, the ranch was already legendary among the locals. But it was a quiet legend, a whisper. The Myers lived there for decades, and they survived by becoming ghosts themselves. They stopped inviting people over, they stopped going out, they secured the perimeter and lived in a state of low-level, constant siege warfare. When they finally left, they didn't just sell a ranch. They passed on a containment unit. So, when Terry Sherman drove his truck onto the property in 1994, seeing the sweeping views and the lush pasture, he wasn't looking at a crime scene. He was looking at a trap that had been set in 1864, baited with silence, and left to wait for the next warm body to walk into its jaws. The Utes watched him move in. They saw the moving trucks. They saw the cattle trailers. And they likely shook their heads knowing that it wasn't a matter of if the land would turn on him. It was only a matter of when. The trap was sprung. The Yi-Naldlushi had fresh game. Chapter 2. The Quiet Tenancy. In the American West, isolation is a geographic fact, but solitude is a social choice. The code of the homesteader was built on a fragile interdependence. You might live 5 miles from your nearest neighbor, but when a barn caught fire or a child went missing, that distance evaporated. You left your door unlocked. You offered coffee to strangers. It was not just politeness, it was a survival strategy. To be alone in the high desert was to be vulnerable. Kenneth and Edith Myers broke the code. They didn't break it with hostility. They didn't threaten trespassers with shotguns or file lawsuits over water rights. They broke it with a silence so profound, so impenetrable, that it eventually erased them from the community's memory while they were still breathing. Kenneth Myers signed the deed to the property in 1934. The country was in the throat of the Great Depression. The Dust Bowl was blowing the topsoil of Oklahoma all the way to Washington, D.C., and land was cheap if you had the stomach to work it. The Myers family arrived with the intention of raising cattle. For the first few years, by all accounts, they were indistinguishable from the other families struggling to coax a living out of the scrub. They went to town. They traded. They were present. Then the aperture began to close. It wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, grinding withdrawal, like a heavy door rusting shut on its hinges. By the 1950s, the Myers had become ghosts in their own zip code. They stopped attending community events. They stopped answering the knock at the door. When neighbors saw Kenneth, he was usually in his truck, staring straight ahead, driving with the urgency of a man moving through enemy territory. They lived on the ranch for 60 years, 6 decades. Think about the psychological toll of a 60-year siege. We look at the Shermans, who would come later, and we pity them for their 20 months of terror. But the Shermans were the flash bang. The Myers were the slow rot. When Kenneth Myers finally died in 1987 and the estate prepared the land for sale, the curtain was briefly pulled back. Prospective buyers and real estate agents walked into the small farmhouse for the first time in half a century. They expected to see a time capsule of rural domesticity. What they found was a fortress designed by a paranoid mind. The architecture of the house had been altered. It wasn't renovated, it was hardened. There were heavy deadbolts on the doors. That in itself is not unusual. But these were double-cylinder deadbolts, keyed on both the outside and the inside. This is a fire hazard. It is illegal in most modern building codes. But in a siege, you don't care about fire safety. You care about containment. You care about ensuring that whatever gets into the kitchen cannot get into the bedroom. Every window was fitted with heavy shutters and reinforced latches. The interior doors, the doors to the pantry, the closets, the hallway, were reinforced. And then there were the dog runs. Out back, anchored into the concrete and the hard earth, were heavy steel chains, not the light gauge chain you use for a heeler or a collie. These were industrial links, thick and rusted, attached to collars that would fit the neck of a mastiff or a wolf. The Myers didn't raise show dogs. They didn't have a breeding operation. Yet, the evidence suggested they kept a pack of massive animals, chained close to the house, forming a biological perimeter, a living alarm system. What were they afraid of? The neighbors told stories of the Myers letting the dogs out at night and hearing them fight. Not the yipping of a coyote skirmish, but the deep, chest-rattling sounds of heavy animals tearing at each other. By morning, the dogs would be wounded or missing. But Kenneth Myers never called a vet. He stitched them up himself, or he buried them. The most chilling detail of the Myers' tenure is not what they said, but what they didn't say. In 1994, when the heirs to the Myers estate finally put the ranch on the market, they listed it as a prime cattle operation, high-quality grazing land, water rights included. The price was attractive. Terry Sherman, looking to upgrade his operation, toured the property. He saw the lush alfalfa fields. He saw the creek. He saw the strange, heavy locks on the doors and likely dismissed them as the eccentricities of an old couple who had watched too much news. He asked the sellers if there were any issues with the property. The answer was a lie of omission so vast it bordered on criminal negligence. They said nothing. They did not mention the lights in the sky. They did not mention the cattle that would vanish without a trace. They did not mention the large wolf-like creatures that shrugged off small arms fire. They simply took the check. The transaction was closed. The Myers family exited the stage, taking their secrets to the grave, leaving the door wide open for a family that had no idea they were buying a ticket to a war zone. Was their silence an act of malice? Or was it the desperate, exhausted act of a family that had spent 60 years holding the door shut against the dark and just wanted to pass the burden to someone else? Chapter 3. The Sherman Siege. Terry Sherman did not buy a mystery. He bought a business. In the summer of 1994, Sherman moved his family, his wife Gwen, his 2 teenage children, onto the property with the specific intent of breeding top-tier hybrid cattle. He was a man who spoke the language of genetics, feed ratios, and market futures. He was not looking for aliens. He was looking for equity. He sank his life savings into the land and the herd. This is a crucial piece of the calculus. When the phenomena began, Sherman couldn't simply pack up the station wagon and leave. He was leveraged. To leave the ranch was to accept financial annihilation. The entity that inhabited the ranch understood this. It knew that Sherman was tethered to the dirt by a mortgage and a herd of Simmental cattle, and it used that leverage to torture him. The war began on a Tuesday, under the bright, forgiving light of a sunlit afternoon. Sherman and his father were out checking the fence line near a grove of cottonwoods. They saw a wolf, But to call it a wolf is to stretch the biological definition of the species. The animal was massive, standing nearly waist-high at the shoulder with a coat of gray and dirty yellow. It did not skulk. It did not growl. It trotted across the field with the casual confidence of a creature that has never known fear. It approached the men. It was docile, almost domesticated. It nudged one of the men, acting like a lost family pet. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, it reached through the corral bars and clamped its jaws onto the snout of a 600-pound calf. The calf screamed. The wolf didn't let go. It began to drag the calf head first through the heavy steel bars. Terry Sherman was carrying a .357 Magnum revolver. This is a weapon designed to stop a human being or a black bear with a single round. Sherman drew the weapon and fired at point-blank range. The bullet struck the wolf in the ribs. The impact should have shattered bone and collapsed a lung. The animal did not flinch. It did not release the calf. Sherman fired again and again. 3 rounds of high-caliber lead into the torso of a living animal. The wolf finally released the calf, but not in pain. It simply looked at Sherman. Its eyes were a flat, pale blue. It turned and trotted away, not in a panic, but with a bored, loping gait. Sherman grabbed a .30-30 rifle from his truck, a weapon used to drop elk at 200 yards, and fired again. He hit the animal in the flank. A chunk of flesh flew off. The wolf kept moving, disappearing into the dense brush near the creek. When Sherman and his father tracked the animal, the trail ended in mud. The tracks simply stopped, as if the creature had evaporated. They found the piece of flesh that had been blown off by the rifle round. It lay on the ground, gray and putrid. It smelled of sulfur and rotten meat. It looked old, as if the thing they had shot was already dead. That was the opening salvo. Over the next 20 months, the Sherman family lived in a state of escalating psychosis. The ranch became a theater of the absurd. They would wake up to find crop circles pressed into the pasture, perfect geometric patterns of flattened grass. But the grass wasn't broken. It was desiccated. All the moisture had been sucked out of the stalks, leaving them brittle as glass. Then came the lights. Not vague stars in the distance, but footballs. Silent, glowing orange craft the size of a suburban house, hovering silently over the tree line. Gwen Sherman, a woman of deep faith and practicality, found herself shepherding her children into a single bedroom at night, sleeping with their clothes on, terrified that something was going to come through the walls. But the entity hit them hardest in the bank account. In less than 2 years, the Shermans lost 14 head of prize cattle to mutilations. This was not predation. This was theft. One cow was found with its reproductive tract removed. Another was found with the blood drained entirely, the heart removed from the chest cavity without breaking the rib cage. Do the math. 14 head of cattle. In $1995, counting the lost potential of breeding stock, Sherman was looking at a loss of tens of thousands of dollars. The ranch was bleeding him dry. The breaking point was not a monster. It was the realization that they were completely alone. The local sheriff was sympathetic but powerless. You cannot arrest a ball of light. You cannot subpoena a poltergeist. On June 30th, 1996, the Deseret News ran a story. It was an act of desperation. Sherman went public not for fame, but because he wanted someone, anyone, to take the land off his hands. The headline read, "Frequent flyers, Utah UFOs keep rancher's family on edge." It was a cry for help, disguised as a tabloid piece. The Shermans were broken. They were sleep-deprived, financially ruined, and psychologically flayed. They had looked into the abyss, and they found that the abyss had a sense of humor, and it enjoyed watching them suffer. They needed a savior, or, at the very least, a buyer with deeper pockets and a bigger ego. And in Las Vegas, a billionaire hotel magnate was reading the morning paper. He didn't see a horror story. He saw an opportunity. If a poor cattle rancher couldn't fight the unknown with a 30-30 rifle, what could a billionaire do with a team of PhDs and an unlimited budget? Chapter 4. The Ledger of the Impossible. There is a specific tax bracket where curiosity ceases to be a hobby and becomes an industry. For the average man, the paranormal is a story told over a beer, a shiver in the dark, a momentary glitch in the matrix that is laughed off by morning. For Robert Bigelow, the paranormal was an engineering problem waiting for a budget. Bigelow was not a cowboy. He was a creature of Las Vegas, a man who had built an empire on the transient nature of American life. He made his fortune with Budget Suites of America, a chain of extended-stay hotels that catered to people in between lives. He understood real estate. He understood the value of a room, a bed, and a lock on the door. But while his bank accounts were filled with the proceeds of terrestrial rent, his mind was occupied with the stars. He didn't just want to believe, he wanted to know. And in America, if you have enough zeros in your portfolio, you can buy the answer to almost any question. In 1995, Bigelow founded the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS. This was not a club for amateur ghost hunters. It was a serious, well-funded research organization. He recruited a murderer's row of talent. Colm Kelleher, a biochemist with a Ph.D. from the University of Dublin, Hal Puthoff, a theoretical physicist, Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut who had walked on the moon. Bigelow was building a Manhattan Project for the supernatural. He just needed a testing ground. When the Deseret News article about the Sherman family broke in June of 1996, Bigelow didn't hesitate. He didn't send an intern. He flew to Utah. The meeting between Terry Sherman and Robert Bigelow is a study in contrast. On one side, you have the cattleman, sun-bleached, exhausted, his hands calloused from fixing fences and burying mutilated livestock. On the other, the tycoon, pale, intense, smelling of air conditioning and jet fuel. Sherman wanted out. He wanted to save his marriage and his sanity. Bigelow wanted in. He wanted the keys to the asylum. The negotiation was short. It was brutal in its efficiency. In September of 1996, the deal was struck. Bigelow purchased the 512 acres for roughly $200,000. Analyze that number. $200,000. For a productive cattle ranch with water rights in the Uintah Basin, it was a fair market price. But for access to what Bigelow believed was a portal to another dimension, it was theft. He bought the most anomalous piece of real estate on earth for the price of a suburban home in Reno. But the money came with strings, heavy ones. As part of the deal, Bigelow required the Shermans to stay on as caretakers for a transition period. He needed their knowledge. He needed them to show his scientists where the wolf walked, where the lights hovered, where the cattle died. He bought their land, and then he rented their trauma. He also bought their silence. A strict non-disclosure agreement was signed. The Shermans, who had gone to the press in a desperate bid for help, were now legally gagged. The ranch went dark. The transition of ownership marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the haunting. Under the Myers and the Shermans, the ranch had been a domestic tragedy. It was a story of families trying to survive a hostile environment. Under Bigelow, it became a laboratory. The cattle trailers pulled out, and the white SUVs pulled in. The farmhouse, once a home, was converted into a command center. The kitchen table where the Shermans had prayed for deliverance was covered in topographic maps and radiation detectors. Bigelow wasn't interested in coexisting with the phenomenon. He didn't respect the path of the Skinwalker as a spiritual boundary. He viewed it as a data set. He brought the hubris of late 20th century capitalism to a place that operated on Stone Age logic. He believed that if you threw enough money, enough sensors, and enough PhDs at a problem, it would eventually crack. He believed that the anomaly could be measured, cataloged, and perhaps eventually monetized. The locals in the Uintah Basin watched this transformation with a mix of amusement and dread. They saw the chain-link fences go up. They saw the no trespassing signs authorized by the NIDS legal team. They saw the patrol cars. Bigelow had effectively privatized a paranormal hotspot. He had drawn a circle around the unknown and declared it absolute private property. But there is a flaw in the logic of the billionaire. You can buy the land. You can buy the silence of the previous tenants. You can even buy the scientists to study the dirt. But you cannot buy the cooperation of the thing that lives beneath it. Bigelow had purchased the theater, and he had hired the audience. But he had forgotten to ask if the performer was willing to put on a show. Or perhaps he failed to consider that when you turn a haunted house into a laboratory, you are not studying the ghosts. You are giving them new toys to play with. The scientists arrived with their spectrum analyzers and their night vision cameras, confident in their objectivity. But what happens when the microscope you're looking through decides to look back? Chapter 5. Instruments of the Invisible Science is, at its core, a faith in repetition. It relies on the assumption that if you drop an apple in London and you drop an apple in Tokyo, they will both fall at the same rate. It assumes the universe is consistent, that it plays fair, and that it will submit to measurement if your ruler is precise enough. Robert Bigelow brought this faith to the Uintah Basin in a caravan of white trucks. By early 1997, the ranch had ceased to be an agricultural operation. It had become a sensor array. The National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS, poured resources into the soil with the zeal of a military occupation. They were not there to experience the phenomenon. They were there to capture it, tag it, and file it away in a folder in Las Vegas. The installation was comprehensive. They erected a command center in the old ranch house, replacing the Sherman's family photos with monitors and magnetic field maps. They ran thousands of feet of cable through the dust. They installed 12 high-resolution surveillance cameras on telephone poles, strategically positioned to cover the hot zones, the West Pasture, the Homestead 2, the Ridgeline. These were not security cameras bought at a hardware store. These were hardened industrial optics designed to function in extreme weather, capable of recording 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The data was fed into digital recorders, backed up and analyzed by staff who had spent careers in intelligence and physics. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: triangulation. If an object appeared, a light, a craft, a creature, it would be caught from multiple angles. They would calculate its speed, its trajectory, its mass. They would reduce the ghost to a math problem. But the ranch does not do math. Almost immediately, the equipment began to fail. And it did not fail in the way electronics usually fail, through battery drainage or short circuits. It failed with personality. Fresh batteries, purchased that morning in Roosevelt, would drain to 0 in minutes. Geiger counters would scream, maxing out their needles in an empty field, only to go dead silent when a researcher stepped forward to investigate. There is a specific incident from 1998 that illustrates the dynamic perfectly. The NIDS team had identified a specific area near the center of the property where the activity seemed to cluster. They decided to set a trap. They installed 3 cameras on a single pole, facing outward in a triangle formation, ensuring a 360-degree field of view. Nothing could approach the pole without being seen. To ensure the cameras themselves were safe, they wrapped the cables in heavy-duty PVC piping and buried them. They secured the connections with duct tape and zip ties. It was a fortress of surveillance. One night, the monitors in the command center flickered. The feed from camera number 3 went into static. Then camera 2, then camera 1. The team, composed of former law enforcement and scientists, rushed to the site. It took them less than 5 minutes to cross the pasture. When they arrived, they found a scene of impossible vandalism. The cameras were not just broken, they had been shredded. The PVC piping, hard plastic capable of withstanding hundreds of pounds of pressure, had been ripped apart. The wiring inside was pulled out, stripped, and scattered in the sagebrush. But here's the detail that keeps you awake at night. The heavy duct tape that secured the connections had not been cut. It had been unspooled. Imagine the dexterity required to find the end of a roll of tape, peel it back, and unwrap it perfectly in pitch blackness in less than 5 minutes, while destroying the rest of the equipment with the force of a hydraulic press. And the footage? The team rushed back to review the tapes, expecting to see the vandal. They expected a bear, a poacher, or perhaps the sabotage of a local prankster. They played the tape. They saw the peaceful night sky. They saw the stars, and then, without a single frame of interference, without a shadow crossing the lens, the signal simply cut. One frame, perfect clarity. The next, black. The intelligence on the ranch had not just evaded the trap, it had dismantled it, mocking the very concept of surveillance. It was telling them, I can see you, you cannot see me, and your machines are toys. By 1999, the budget for the project was swelling into the millions. Bigelow was paying for 24-hour armed security. He was paying salaries, equipment costs, and travel expenses. And in return, he was getting a filing cabinet full of anomalies that contradicted each other. The scientists were demoralized. They were trained to observe the mouse in the maze. They were slowly realizing that they were the mice, and the maze was changing shape every time they turned a corner. Colm Kelleher, the biochemist leading the team, began to note a disturbing pattern. The phenomenon was precognitive. It seemed to know when the cameras were off. It seemed to know where the team was looking, and it would invariably manifest exactly where they were not. If they pointed a camera north, the activity happened south. If they brought a team to the ridge, the activity happened at the homestead. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the cat was invisible, and the mouse was armed with a Ph.D. The golden age of the ranch was turning into a stalemate. The instruments of the invisible were useless against a force that could edit itself out of reality. The team began to carry guns not for protection against trespassers, but because the psychological weight of the place was triggering a primal fight-or-flight response. They were hunting a ghost, and the ghost was starting to get aggressive. And soon, the ghost would stop breaking cameras and start testing the durability of flesh and bone. If a lens couldn't capture the truth, maybe a bullet could? Was the shift to violence a reaction to the invasion? Or was the ranch simply tired of being watched? Chapter 6. Ballistics and the Void. By the winter of 1997, the methodology of the National Institute for Discovery Science had begun to curdle. The scientific method requires a cooperative subject. You poke, it reacts. You measure the reaction. But the entity at Skinwalker Ranch refused to be a subject. It was behaving like an opponent. Frustration is a dangerous variable in a laboratory. When men with PhDs and military backgrounds spend months staring at sagebrush, freezing in the dark, and being mocked by equipment failures, the veneer of academic detachment begins to crack. They stop thinking like biologists and start thinking like soldiers. The cameras weren't working. The sensors were being jammed. So, the strategy shifted. If they couldn't measure the ghost, they would try to kill it, or at least shoot it and see if it bled. The ranch became a theater of armed patrol. NIDS personnel, often accompanied by Terry Sherman, who was now acting as a paid guide through his own personal hell, began carrying sidearms and rifles. This was the moment the project crossed the Rubicon. They were no longer observing a natural phenomenon. They were hunting a predator. And on the night of August 25, 1997, the predator opened a door. 2 NIDS researchers were stationed on the mesa, a high ridge that overlooks the property. It was 2:30 in the morning. The air was dead calm. Below them, the basin was a pool of ink. Suddenly, a light appeared. But it wasn't the typical orb or the floating footballs the Shermans had reported. This was a dull, yellow-orange loop. It expanded silently, hovering about 1,000 feet above the ground. Through their Generation 3 night vision binoculars, military-grade optics that turned the dark into a grainy green day, they saw something that defied the laws of optics. The light wasn't an object. It was an aperture. It was a hole in the three-dimensional fabric of the night sky, and something was crawling out of it. The researchers watched in paralyzed silence as a black, faceless humanoid form pulled itself through the tunnel. It didn't float. It scrambled like a man climbing out of a sewer grate. It dropped into the darkness of the ridge. Then the tunnel collapsed into a single point of light and vanished. They had witnessed an insertion. This event changed the psychological landscape of the team. They were dealing with an intelligence that could deploy assets, and the assets were getting closer. The tension culminated in an incident that remains the darkest stain on the NIDS record. It involves the most reliable biological sensors on the planet, dogs. The Shermans had lost dogs before, but the NIDS team brought their own security. They had trained tracking dogs, animals that didn't know fear, animals bred to corner bears and mountain lions. On a clear night in 1998, a blue orb, the size of a baseball, appeared near the homestead. It was buzzing, moving with the erratic flight path of a hummingbird. It wasn't fleeing, it was luring. 3 dogs took the bait. They broke into a sprint, chasing the light into a dense thicket of Russian olive trees near the creek bed. The researchers heard the dogs barking. It was the aggressive, rhythmic bark of the pack cornering prey. Then there was a yelp, not a fight, not a struggle, just a single, cut-off sound of surprise. Then absolute silence. The researchers called out. Nothing. They waited, rifles raised, scanning the brush. Nothing. Fear is a heavy thing to carry through a dark field. It took them an hour to work up the courage to enter the thicket. When they finally pushed through the branches, they didn't find the dogs. They didn't find bodies. They didn't find blood. They found 3 scorch marks on the ground. Grease spots. There was no bone, no fur, no teeth. Just a blackened, oily residue on the dirt and the smell of ozone and burnt hair. 3 living, breathing mammals, totaling perhaps 200 pounds of biomass, had been instantaneously converted into energy. The efficiency of the destruction was absolute. It was a physics lesson delivered with brutal cruelty. The message was clear. You bring cameras, we break them. You bring guns, we ignore them. You bring living things to hunt us, we will erase them. The NIDS team collected soil samples from the grease spots. They sent them to the lab. The analysis showed unusual biological residues, but nothing that explained the mechanism of death. You cannot autopsy a void. This was the breaking point for the illusion of control. Robert Bigelow had spent millions. He had bought 512 acres of liability. He had men with rifles patrolling the perimeter, but they were guarding a house where the walls could dissolve at will. They had tried to shoot the wolf. They had tried to chase the light, and the ranch had responded by showing them that their weapons were as primitive as sticks and stones. But the horror wasn't done with them. As the golden age of the investigation collapsed under the weight of fear and failure, the researchers made a terrifying discovery. They thought they could leave the ranch at the end of their shift. They thought they could drive back to Las Vegas, wash the dust off their clothes, and sleep in their own beds. They were wrong. The anomaly was not a place, it was an infection, and they were already carrying it home to their wives and children. If a ghost can travel through a hole in the sky, what makes you think it can't follow you down the interstate? Chapter 7. The Hitchhiker Effect. There is a comforting lie we tell ourselves about the scientific method. The observer is distinct from the experiment. We believe that we can look through the microscope, record the data, and then walk away, leaving the bacteria on the slide. We believe in the sanctity of the decontamination chamber. We believe that if we wash our hands and burn our clothes, we are clean. But what if the pathogen isn't biological? What if the infection is informational? By the early 2000s, the men of NIDS were beginning to realize that they had made a catastrophic error in their risk assessment. They had treated the ranch as a location, a specific set of GPS coordinates bounded by a fence. They assumed that if they left the 512 acres, they left the phenomenon behind. They were wrong. The anomaly was not a ghost haunting a house. It was a virus searching for a host. And the scientists, with their high-level security clearances and their frequent flyer miles, were the perfect vectors. This phenomenon is now known in intelligence circles as the hitchhiker effect. It is the most terrifying aspect of the entire Skinwalker narrative because it dismantled the one thing the researchers had left: the safety of their own homes. Consider the case of a NIDS intelligence officer. Let's call him Axelrod. He was a hardened professional, a man trained to compartmentalize. He spent weeks on the ranch, hunting the lights, enduring the psychological pressure of the mesa. When his rotation ended, he flew home to Virginia, 3,000 miles away from the Uintah Basin. He thought he was safe. He thought the distance of a continent was a sufficient firewall. It started with small things. Cold spots in the hallway, the feeling of being watched in the shower, the family dog staring at an empty corner, hackles raised, growling at the drywall. Then the firewall collapsed. One afternoon his wife was in the garden. She looked up and saw a large wolf-like creature standing at the edge of the manicured suburban lawn. It was the same impossible biology seen on the ranch, the oversized shoulders, the wrong eyes. In the middle of a Virginia suburb, miles from the nearest wilderness, the ranch had manifested. It didn't attack. It simply let her know it was there. It was a psychological tag. The horror escalated. The virus jumped to the children. They began to see orbs in their bedrooms, blue and white spheres of light that floated through the walls. These weren't dreams. They were waking hallucinations shared by multiple witnesses in the same room. And then came the physical toll. We are not talking about stress or fatigue. We are talking about verifiable medical pathology. NIDS researchers and their families began to develop rare autoimmune disorders, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, lupus-like symptoms, strange, aggressive cancers appearing in individuals with no genetic history of the disease. The data is chilling. In one documented cluster, multiple individuals associated with the program developed similar inflammatory conditions within months of each other. It was as if exposure to the ranch was radioactive. But instead of emitting gamma rays, the land emitted a signal that scrambled the human immune system. Robert Bigelow was facing a nightmare. He was an employer. He had a duty of care. He had sent men into a zone of high strangeness to collect data, and they had brought home a plague that was attacking their wives and children. The ledger of the impossible was now recording medical bills. By 2004, the NIDS Institute was winding down. The public explanation was a lack of hard data. The cameras yielded nothing but static. The sensors were unreliable, but the private truth was much darker. The cost of doing business was becoming too high. The liability was uninsurable. The entity had effectively flanked them. It didn't fight them on the ranch where they were armed and ready. It followed them home. It attacked them where they were soft, at the dinner table, in the nursery, in the doctor's office. It dismantled the skepticism of the researchers by targeting the people they loved. You can dismiss a light in the sky as a weather balloon. You cannot dismiss your child screaming because a shadow man is standing at the foot of their bed. The NIDS era ended in a retreat. Bigelow had stared into the void, and the void had followed him home to Las Vegas. But in Washington, D.C., there were men who looked at these reports, the biological effects, the psychological warfare, the ability to bypass physical distance, and they didn't see a ghost story. They saw a threat assessment. If this force could track a scientist across the country and inflict physical harm, what could it do to a senator? What could it do to a nuclear silo? The files didn't go into the trash. They went to the Pentagon. And the budget was about to jump from the millions to the tens of millions. If private money couldn't solve the riddle, Maybe the Defense Intelligence Agency could? Chapter 8. Shadows in the Pentagon. There is a popular misconception that the United States government is a monolithic entity, an all-seeing eye that knows every secret and holds every key. The truth is more fractured. The government is a collection of fiefdoms, warring tribes of bureaucrats, and silos of information that do not speak to one another. But there is one currency that transcends these borders: fear. If you can prove a threat exists, the checkbook opens. By 2007, the reports from Skinwalker Ranch had migrated from Robert Bigelow's private desk in Las Vegas to the secure reading rooms of the Capitol. These files did not contain the ramblings of madmen. They contained the observations of physicists, the medical records of intelligence officers, and the trajectory data of objects that violated the laws of aerodynamics. Senator Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader from Nevada, was a man who understood the mechanics of power. He also understood that there were things in the Nevada and Utah desert that did not appear in the public budget. When he looked at the NIDS data, he didn't see a ghost story. He saw a gap in national defense. If a foreign adversary, China, Russia, had developed a technology that could manipulate human consciousness, cause directed biological harm, and bypass conventional radar, the United States was already losing a war. It didn't know it was fighting. The meeting that changed everything did not happen in a bunker. It happened in the quiet, carpeted offices where the real business of the Republic is conducted. Reid sat down with Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska and Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii. These were men who controlled the black budget, the classified spending that exists in the shadows of the congressional record. They authorized a program. The acronym was AAWCP, the Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Applications Program. The mandate was specific. They weren't paying for a seance. They were paying for a threat assessment. The Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, was brought into the fold. The contract was awarded to a subsidiary of Bigelow's empire, Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, BAIS. The price tag was $22 million. Let that number settle. $22 million of taxpayer money. This wasn't a grant for the arts. This was defense spending authorized in 2008, allocated to study a piece of scrubland where wolves were bulletproof and orbs flew through walls. The ranch had been drafted. The tone of the investigation shifted instantly. The scientists were no longer just academics. They were now operating under the umbrella of the Department of Defense. The security clearances required to walk the perimeter went from private to top-secret, sensitive, compartmented information. DIA analysts began to visit the property. These were men trained to analyze satellite imagery of North Korean missile silos. They were men of logic, hardened by the Cold War. They arrived at the ranch with clipboards and skepticism, convinced that the anomalies were either hallucinations or terrestrial test aircraft. The ranch, as it always does, took their skepticism as a challenge. One DIA official, a man with a career built on rational analysis, was standing in the living room of the homestead. He was looking at the fireplace. In front of him, a three-dimensional object, a shape often described as a twisted pretzel or a Mobius strip, materialized out of thin air. It wasn't a hologram. It was solid. It rotated slowly, defying gravity, humming with a low-frequency vibration that rattled the teeth. The official watched it. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply froze, his worldview shattering in real time. Then the object vanished. But the hitchhiker effect did not respect his badge. Following his visit, the phenomena followed him back to the East Coast. The infection spread to his home. His family began to experience poltergeist activity, objects moving, shadows in the peripheral vision, the dread of being watched. The $22 million bought reports. It bought a massive database known as DIRD, Defense Intelligence Reference Documents. These papers covered everything from invisibility cloaking to wormholes, stargates, and negative energy. They were attempting to reverse engineer the physics of the ranch. They were looking for the on switch. They wanted to weaponize the anomaly. Imagine if the United States military could deploy a hitchhiker effect against a terrorist cell. Imagine an orb that could fly through a bunker wall and disable the occupants with radiation. But the ranch refused to be conscripted. The data remained chaotic. For every measurement that suggested a propulsion system, there was another that suggested a spiritual manifestation. The entity would perform for a day, providing tantalizing clues, and then go dormant for months. It would provide false leads. It would mimic the technology the researchers were using. By 2010, the Pentagon was getting restless. The $22 million had been spent. The reports were thick, dense with academic theory, but light on actionable intelligence. There was no gun to build. There was no plane to fly. There was only a terrifying realization that the phenomenon was beyond the current comprehension of human science. The money dried up. The DIA, fearing a public relations disaster if it leaked that they were hunting skinwalkers with defense funds, quietly closed the checkbook. The program was buried. The files were locked away in the deepest recesses of the intelligence community. Bigelow was left holding the bag. He had the land, he had the trauma, and he had the silence of the government. The experiment had failed. The billionaire and the Pentagon had thrown their combined weight against the door, and the door hadn't budged. When the most powerful military in the history of the world retreats from a battlefield, they don't call it a defeat. They call it a strategic withdrawal. But make no mistake, on the dusty plains of the Uintah Basin, the Pentagon blinked, and if $22 million and the full attention of the Defense Intelligence Agency couldn't crack the code, what hope was left for a private owner? Chapter 9. The Retreat. In the world of high-stakes venture capital, there is a concept known as the burn rate. It is the speed at which a company consumes its cash reserves before it either turns a profit or dies. Robert Bigelow was burning cash, credibility, and the sanity of his staff. By 2011, the fervor of the AOWSAP program had cooled. The Pentagon had quietly withdrawn its funding, leaving the ranch to drift back into the private sector's hands. The $22 million had evaporated, converted into stacks of classified reports that sat in secure lockers in Washington, gathering dust but offering no solutions. The problem wasn't a lack of activity. The problem was the quality of the activity. Bigelow had spent nearly 2 decades chasing the dragon. He had accumulated terabytes of data. He had hours of magnetic signatures, soil samples with anomalous isotopes, and witness testimony from men with the highest security clearances in the nation. But he did not have the one thing that science demands: reproducibility. You could not make the wolf appear on command. You could not schedule an orb sighting for a visiting senator. The ranch operated on a schedule of capricious malice. It would give a spectacular show to a lone security guard on a Tuesday night, a portal opening, a creature crawling out, and then offer 6 months of absolute crushing silence to a team of physicists with $1 million of equipment. It was the ultimate trickster dynamic. The intelligence was not just elusive, it was mocking the very attempt to study it. Bigelow was a man of results. He built hotels that made money. He built space modules that held air. He was accustomed to the laws of commerce and physics, where input equals output. At Skinwalker Ranch, the input was millions of dollars, and the output was confusion. The retreat began slowly. First, the staff was reduced, the round-the-clock surveillance, the armed guards, the rotation of scientists. It was all scaled back. The NIDS website, once a beacon for the paranormal community, went dormant. The institute was dissolved. The ranch fell into a state of quiet maintenance. The caretakers remained, patrolling the fence line, checking the locks. But the aggressive hunt was over. The cameras were left running, recording the wind and the sagebrush, storing petabytes of nothingness on hard drives that no one had the energy to review. Bigelow, now in his 70s, had to face a bitter truth. He had bought the ticket, taken the ride, and arrived nowhere. He had stared into the abyss longer than almost any man alive, and the abyss had simply bored him into submission. In 2016, the decision was made. He would sell, but you do not list a property like Skinwalker Ranch on Zillow. You do not put a for sale sign on the gate of a biological hazard zone. The transaction had to be handled with the same secrecy that had defined the previous 20 years. Bigelow wanted out, but he cared about the legacy. He wouldn't sell to a developer who wanted to put up condos. He wouldn't sell to a curiosity seeker. He needed a buyer who understood the gravity of the deed. Enter Adamantium Real Estate, LLC. On April 5, 2016, the deed was transferred. The sale price was roughly $4.5 million, a significant markup from the $200,000 Bigelow paid, but a pittance when you consider the infrastructure and the notoriety. The buyer was hidden behind a shell company, a limited liability corporation named after a fictional indestructible metal. It was a shield designed to protect the identity of the new owner from the inevitable media circus. Bigelow packed up his data. He took the DIRD reports, the medical files, and the best of the footage. He left the ranch physically, but he kept the intellectual property. He left the keys on the table, but he took the instruction manual. As the Bigelow trucks rolled out of the Uintah Basin for the final time, the locals watched with a mix of relief and suspicion. The black helicopters were gone. The men in the dark SUVs were gone. The ranch sat silent under the Utah sun, its secrets intact, its soil undisturbed. The fence line remained. The warning signs faded in the ultraviolet light. The cattle of the neighbors grazed nervously near the perimeter. It felt like an ending. The great experiment had failed. The billionaire had retreated to Las Vegas, defeated by a patch of dirt that refused to be quantified. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the supernatural. The silence of 2016 was not a peace treaty. It was a changing of the guard. Bigelow had treated the ranch like a laboratory, a place of quiet study and passive observation. He was a scientist at heart, careful and methodical. But the man hiding behind Adamantium Real Estate was not a scientist. He was a tech mogul. He was younger, louder, and raised on a different kind of faith. He didn't want to study the ranch from a distance. He wanted to land a helicopter in the center of the anomaly and demand an answer. Bigelow had tried to outweight the ghost. What would happen when the new owner decided to provoke it? Chapter 10, The Adamantium Key. For 18 months, the ranch existed in a legal limbo. The deed holder was listed as Adamantium Real Estate LLC. It was a black box. To the casual observer, it looked like a holding company for a comic book fan, a reference to the indestructible metal laced into Wolverine's skeleton, a joke, shield. But the money behind the shield was serious, and it was local. In the spring of 2016, the secrecy broke. The man who stepped out of the black Airbus H-130 helicopter wasn't a defense contractor. He wasn't a spook from the DIA. He was wearing a bespoke suit, a crisp white shirt, and he looked like he had just walked out of a boardroom in Salt Lake City. Brandon Fugal. Fugal is a study in specific American contradictions. He is a titan of commercial real estate, the chairman of Coldwell Banker Commercial in Utah. He is a man who deals in square footage, lease rates, and glass skyscrapers. He is deeply religious, a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He collects movie memorabilia. He owns the original robe from the Ten Commandments. He bought Skinwalker Ranch not as a military asset, but as the ultimate collectible. The price tag was $4.5 million, a rounding error for a man who manages billions in transactional volume. But Fugal didn't just bring his checkbook. He brought an entourage. He brought a philosophy that was diametrically opposed to the monastic silence of the Bigelow era. Bigelow was the hermit in the tower. Fugal was the ringmaster. He arrived with a new security chief, Bryant Dragon Arnold, a man whose nickname and demeanor suggested that the era of passive observation was over. The NIDS guards were replaced by a team that looked less like scientists and more like a private military contractor. They wore black. They carried AR-15s. They patrolled the fence line with an aggression that suggested they were daring something to cross it. The infrastructure of the ranch was overhauled. The old rotting sensor arrays left by NIDS were ripped out. In their place came a new nervous system. Fugal invested millions into a state-of-the-art command center. We are talking about thousands of feet of fiber optic cable buried in the rocky soil. We are talking about tri-field meters, spectrum analyzers, and a surveillance grid that fed terabytes of data into a central server room that hummed with the cooling fans of a data center. Fugal called it the command center. It looked like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise transplanted into a double-wide trailer in the middle of a cow pasture. But the most significant change wasn't the hardware. It was the transparency. Under Bigelow, the ranch was a black hole. Data went in, and nothing came out. The non-disclosure agreements were ironclad. Fugal had a different vision. He wanted to document everything. He brought in cameras, not just security cameras, but production cameras. He opened the gates to a television crew from the History Channel. He effectively turned the most dangerous 512 acres on the planet into a reality TV set. Critics called it a circus. They said he was monetizing the mystery, turning a solemn scientific inquiry into entertainment. They pointed to the dramatic music, the edited suspense, the dragon scowling at the camera. But look closer at the strategy. By broadcasting the investigation, Fugel did something the Pentagon could never do. He crowdsourced the observation. He put millions of eyes on the anomaly. He removed the ability of the government to bury the findings, because the findings were airing on Tuesday nights to a global audience. He assembled a new team. Dr. Travis Taylor, an astrophysicist with a resume that included work for NASA and the Department of Defense. Eric Bard, a plasma physicist with the calm demeanor of a man wiring a bomb. They weren't there to write reports for a dusty archive. They were there to engage. The adamantium era was defined by a shift in posture. Bigelow's team had been hunters waiting in a blind, hoping the deer would walk by. Fugel's team decided to burn down the forest to flush the game out. They brought in rockets. They brought in high-powered lasers. They brought in flamethrowers. The logic was aggressive and simple. The entity had ignored passive observation. It had mocked the quiet study. So, they would stop being quiet. They would poke the nest. They would stimulate the environment with high-energy inputs and see if the environment fought back. It was a dangerous gamble. They were applying the scientific method with a sledgehammer. As the first rockets were prepped on the launch pad in 2019, aimed directly at the anomaly in the sky above the triangle, the mood on the ranch shifted. The air grew heavy. The electronics began to glitch. The entity had spent 20 years dealing with spies and scientists who tried to hide in the dark. Now, it was facing a man in a tailored suit who was landing helicopters on its front lawn and firing rockets at its face. The silence was over. The provocation had begun. But if you throw a rock at a hornet's nest, you don't just get a buzzing sound. You get a swarm. And this swarm had teeth that could tear through the fuselage of a helicopter. Was Fugel unlocking the secrets of the universe, or was he simply ringing the doorbell of a house that should have remained condemned? Chapter 11. Poke the Nest. In the history of scientific inquiry, the observer effect is a polite nuisance. It is the idea that by measuring a particle, you change its behavior. But at Skinwalker Ranch, the observer effect is not a quantum quirk. It is a contact sport. By the summer of 2019, the new team assembled by Brandon Fugel had come to a consensus. Patience was a failed strategy. For 20 years, men had sat in the dark, waiting for the phenomenon to manifest. They had been polite guests. They had asked permission. And in return, they had received silence, obfuscation, and the occasional dead cow. Dr. Travis Taylor, the astrophysicist brought in to lead the investigation, proposed a radical shift in doctrine. If the ranch was an organism, an immune system, as they suspected, then the only way to map it was to trigger a response. They called it stimulation, a sterile, academic word for what was in practice an artillery barrage. The plan was to turn the 512 acres into a target range. They would not wait for the anomaly. They would attack it. They would fire rockets into the airspace. They would blast specific radio frequencies at the ridgeline. They would shine high-powered lasers into the dark spots of the sky. They were no longer hunting. They were baiting. On a blistering afternoon in July, the team set up a launch pad in the center of the triangle. These were not toy rockets. These were high-altitude, instrumentation-laden projectiles capable of reaching 5,000 feet in seconds. They were equipped with sensors to measure radiation, magnetic fields, and temperature. The target was a specific zone roughly 3,000 feet above the homestead, a place where the GPS signals consistently failed, and where the NIDS team had reported seeing the portal years prior. The countdown began. The button was pressed. The rocket screamed off the pad, a streak of white smoke against the hard blue of the Utah sky. It climbed perfectly, 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet. Then the physics broke. The telemetry data showed the rocket hitting a wall, not a physical wall of brick or stone, but an invisible barrier of electromagnetic density. The rocket didn't explode. It didn't veer off course due to wind. It simply stopped transmitting. Simultaneously on the ground, the radiation detectors screamed a spike of gamma rays, the kind of radiation you expect to see near a collapsed star or a leaking reactor, washed over the launch site. It was brief, intense, and impossible. There is no natural source of gamma radiation in the Uintah Basin. Travis Taylor looked at his dosimeter. He had been exposed. In the days following the launch, Taylor, a man who had spent his life dealing with the hard realities of orbital mechanics and defense systems, began to feel the physical toll of the stimulation. Nausea. Strange burns on his skin that resembled radiation dermatitis. The ranch was fighting back. But the team didn't stop. They escalated. One night, they deployed a high-powered green laser capable of projecting a beam for miles. They aimed it at the anomaly in the sky, the spot where the rocket had failed. The beam shot up, a solid line of emerald light cutting through the darkness. And then, at exactly 2,500 feet, the light stopped. Light does not stop. It travels until it hits matter. If there is no matter, no cloud, no smoke, no dust, it continues into infinity. But here, in the clear desert air, the beam terminated. It mushroomed out, as if it were hitting a ceiling of black glass. The team watched in stunned silence. They were seeing the architecture of the trap. They were tracing the ceiling of the cage. Then came the UAPs. Almost immediately after the laser test, the surveillance cameras picked up movement. An object, fast and silent, banked over the ridge line. It wasn't a plane. It had no transponder. It moved with the erratic, insect-like twitch of something that doesn't care about inertia. They had poked the nest, and the hornets were swarming. But the most terrifying reaction wasn't in the sky. It was in the dirt. During a drilling operation near the homestead, an attempt to see if something was buried beneath the soil, the equipment began to malfunction. A brand-new drill rig, costing tens of thousands of dollars, seized up. The electronics fried. And then a cow died. It was the first mutilation of the new era. A calf, healthy and strong, found dead hours after the drilling began. No blood, no struggle. Just the silent surgical removal of soft tissue. A calling card left for the new tenants. It was a warning. You can fire your rockets. You can shine your lasers. But we still control the biology here. The cost of the stimulation strategy was becoming clear. They were getting data, yes. They were recording radiation spikes of 50 microrads per hour. They were capturing video of lights that defied explanation. But they were also engaging in a kinetic exchange with a superior force. They were throwing stones at a tank, and the tank was starting to turn its turret toward them. But amidst the chaos, the radiation burns, and the dead cattle. A pattern began to emerge. The interference wasn't random. The static on the radios wasn't just noise. There was a rhythm to it, a frequency. The team realized they weren't just being attacked. They were being hailed. The ghost wasn't screaming. It was broadcasting. Could the very thing that was poisoning them also be trying to speak to them? Chapter 12. the signal in the noise. For centuries, the primary instrument used to engage with the unknown was the human voice. We chanted, we prayed, we screamed into the dark. We assumed that if there were spirits in the Uintah Basin, they operated on the frequency of emotion. But in the 21st century, we stopped listening with our ears and started listening with software-defined radios, and we found that the entity doesn't speak in Latin or Navajo, it speaks in hertz. The breakthrough, if you can call a terrifying realization a breakthrough, happened in the command center. Among the banks of monitors and the tangle of cooling wires, Eric Bard, the team's principal scientist, noticed a persistent intruder on the spectrum analyzer. It was a sharp, aggressive spike at exactly 1.6 gigahertz. To the layman, 1.6 gigahertz is just a number. To a signals intelligence officer or a telecommunications engineer, it is a smoking gun. This range, specifically the L-band, is not a public sandbox. You cannot buy a walkie-talkie at Walmart that broadcasts on this frequency. The Federal Communications Commission and the International Telecommunication Union have carved up the electromagnetic spectrum like a pie, and this slice is reserved. It is used for GPS. It is used for Iridium satellite uplinks. It is used for space-to-Earth communication. So why was a patch of dirt in Utah broadcasting on a channel reserved for orbital infrastructure? The signal wasn't constant. It was tactical. Throughout 2020 and 2021, the team documented a chilling correlation. Every time the signal appeared, screaming out of the background noise like a siren, something physical would happen. A UAP would appear over the triangle. A researcher would get dizzy. A sensor would fail. It was a handshake, a command sequence. The most disturbing instance occurred during a rocket launch in 2021. As the countdown hit zero, the 1.6 gigahertz signal spiked. Simultaneously, the rocket's guidance system, shielded military-grade electronics, went haywire. The rocket veered off course. The ranch was jamming them. But the signal was only half the equation. If there is a broadcast, there must be a transmitter, and a transmitter requires power. It requires infrastructure. The team turned their eyes from the sky to the ground. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, GPR, and magnetometers. They scanned the mesa, the imposing ridge of rock that runs along the northern edge of the property, the same ridge where the portal had been seen, the same ridge the Utes refused to walk upon. The data that came back from the GPR did not show solid rock. It showed void. It showed structure. Buried within the mesa, roughly 30 to 50 feet beneath the heavy sandstone cap, the radar waves hit something they couldn't penetrate. It was a dome-shaped object, massive in scale, hundreds of feet across. The density was wrong. The magnetic signature was wrong. It wasn't a cave. Nature builds caves with chaotic, jagged geometry. This was symmetrical. They tried to drill into it. They brought in a heavy rig, intending to punch a hole through the rock and take a core sample of the anomaly. The drill bit, tipped with industrial diamond capable of cutting through granite, hit the layer. It didn't cut. It didn't chip. It stopped. The equipment seized. The hydraulic lines shuddered. It was as if they had hit a shield of impenetrable, hardened material. Connect the dots. You have a signal broadcasting on a satellite frequency. You have a massive metallic density dome buried under the rock. You have a response mechanism that targets technology with precise bursts of radiation. This effectively killed the ghost theory. Ghosts do not jam GPS signals. Demons do not live in hardened subterranean bunkers that deflect diamond drill bits. The narrative of the ranch shifted violently from the supernatural to the technological. The team began to whisper a new word: machine. What if Skinwalker Ranch is not a haunted house, but a dormant piece of hardware? What if the portal is not magic, but a mechanism? What if the orange lights are not spirits, but the automated security drones of a system that has been buried in the mud for 10,000 years? This realization stripped away the romanticism of the legend. It replaced the fear of the devil with the cold dread of the artificial. If it is a machine, who built it? The Utes didn't build it. The Spanish missionaries didn't build it. The technology required to bury a structure of that size inside a mountain and keep it powered for millennia exceeds anything the United States Department of Defense possesses in 2026. We are left with a terrifying possibility. The ranch is not a window. It is a door, and the lock is electronic. The signal at 1.6 gigahertz is the key turning in the tumbler, and we are the burglars, standing on the porch, picking at the deadbolt with hairpins, utterly oblivious to what is waiting on the other side of the threshold. We have spent decades asking if we are alone in the universe. We look to Mars. We look to Alpha Centauri. We built the Hubble and the James Webb telescopes to peer into the deepest recesses of time. But what if we were looking in the wrong direction? What if the proof of non-human intelligence isn't waiting for us in a distant galaxy, but has been sleeping beneath a cattle ranch in Utah, waiting for us to invent a radio capable of hearing it wake up? Now that we know the ghost is a machine, only one question remains, a question that hangs over the entire 512 acres like a guillotine blade. If the machine is waking up, what was it designed to do? Chapter 13, The Mirror, the Unknowable. Acre, stand at the gate today. The view hasn't changed much since 1864. The sagebrush is still gray-green and dusty. The mesas still hold up the sky like the pillars of a ruined temple. The wind still kicks up the red dirt, coating the no trespassing signs in a fine layer of grit. To the uninitiated eye, these 512 acres look like any other patch of high desert in the American West. It is dry, it is harsh, it is quiet. But we know better now. We know that the quiet is not peace. It is the held breath of a predator. Over the course of this story, we have watched men try to conquer this land with every tool available to the human species. The Utes tried to bind it with spiritual borders and folklore. The Myers family tried to hold it back with locks, chains, and 60 years of silence. Terry Sherman tried to work it with cattle and sweat. Robert Bigelow tried to buy it with checks written against a defense contractor's fortune. The Pentagon tried to classify it with $22 million of black budget funding. And Brandon Fugel tried to provoke it with rockets and lasers. And what is the result? The ranch remains undefeated. The scientists have come and gone. Their sensors have rusted or been packed away in pelican cases. The data they collected, the terabytes of magnetic readings, the spectrum analysis, the blurry videos of orbs, sits on hard drives in Las Vegas and Salt Lake City. It is a library of confusion, a monument to the limits of our understanding. We wanted the ranch to be a puzzle we could solve. We wanted it to be aliens, because aliens are biological. We understand biology. We wanted it to be a government experiment, because governments are bureaucratic. We understand bureaucracy. We wanted it to to be ghosts, because ghosts imply an afterlife, and that is comforting. But the ranch refused to be any of those things. It jammed our GPS at 1.6 gigahertz. It burned our skin with transient gamma rays. It ignored our property laws and our physics. It acted as a mirror. When we looked at Skinwalker Ranch, we didn't see the truth of the universe. We saw the reflection of our own arrogance. We saw our desperate need to categorize the wild, to put a fence around the infinite and call it property. Think back to that morning in January of 1994. Think back to Terry Sherman standing in the snow, his breath steaming in the 20 below zero air, looking down at a prize cow that had been surgically dismantled. Remember the detail that mattered most. There was no blood. The snow was pristine. The silence was absolute. 30 years later, the snow has melted and fallen again a dozen times. The Shermans are gone. The cows are gone. But the message remains exactly the same. The incision is still clean. The extraction is still precise. And we are still standing in the cold, looking at the evidence of a power we cannot comprehend, terrified by the fact that it left no footprints. The ranch is a reminder that the map is not the territory. We have mapped the human genome. We have mapped the surface of Mars. We have split the atom. But here, in a forgotten corner of Utah, there is a door we cannot open, a signal we cannot decode, and a landlord we cannot evict. We leave the ranch as we found it, a mystery wrapped in barbed wire. The lights will continue to dance over the mesa, whether we are watching them or not. The signal will continue to scream into the void. The soil will continue to hold its secrets. We walk away, not with answers, but with a humbler understanding of our place in the food chain. We are not the masters of this domain. We are merely the transient tenants, passing through a room that was occupied long before we arrived, and will be occupied long after we are dust. As the sun sets behind the Uintah Mountains, casting that long, bruising shadow across the basin one last time, ask yourself the question that haunts every man who has ever signed the deed to this cursed ground. When you stare into the dark, and the dark stares back, do you really want to know what it sees?